fly fighters from the piston engine to the jet age. The others mentioned in Colin's new book served their country with everything they had, and in very hard times, and often with very little assistance or understanding from Reichsmarschall Hermann Wilhelm Göring, who commanded the Luftwaffe and was second in command only to Adolf Hitler. In World War I, Göring was the last commander of the legendary Richthofen Squadron, and he received the highest decoration, the Pour le Mérite. However, in World War II he made many mistakes, costing many German lives. Colin Heaton gives the listeners a chance to look behind the still prevailing opinions in Germany against the German soldiers, honorable men who served their nation during World War II, even though our fortunes had changed. They were men of conscience, feeling, courage, morals, and honor. After Stalingrad, we fought a losing battle. But even worse, we fought our own leadership, which was not in touch with reality and did not properly support our military in the very war that our leaders had started. Our thanks should go out to all fair-minded historians like Colin, who are writing in the United States, Canada, and the United Kingdom, and treating us with a fair consideration. They have helped us to overcome the treatment we received after the war, and are still enduring in Germany today. This reminds me of when, 25 years ago, approximately 2,000 American enthusiasts paid $20 each to see and listen to Adolf Galland, Günther Rall, Walter Krupinski, and others at a symposium. They took part in a seminar in Long Beach, California, which was sponsored by Virginia Bader. Adolf Galland was impressed with the friendly reception and the high number of participants. He then mentioned that if a similar seminar had been held in Germany, there may have been perhaps 100 or so persons who would have come, but they would all have been outside protesting. This book shows what our men had to say, in their own words, about their experiences. They had no agenda, and they had nothing to protect. They just wanted the truth to be told, in full, to ensure that history would see all of us as honorable German airmen who served our nation, as would any man in time of war. Thank you, Colin and Anne, for your book, which gives the listeners a chance to find out how some of our most famous aces lived and survived an unforgettable time in their lives. Introduction. Over the last quarter century of interviewing veterans from all conflicts, this collection of interviews with the Luftwaffe pilots tended to be the most enjoyable endeavor. Having come to know these men in varying degrees, and becoming friends with most of them, it seemed only appropriate to publish these full interviews in a single collection as a series of books. Listeners who are familiar with such publications as Aviation History, World War II, and Military History may remember the abridged versions of some of these interviews, as they were published by Cowell's History Group, later Prime Media Publications, and more recently the wider History Group. This book, and the others to follow, provides the unabridged full-length interviews, complete with greater details. We hope that these interviews, as they are presented, will enlighten and entertain the listeners, as well as enhance the study of aviation history and World War II in general. It has been a great privilege to have been afforded the opportunity to meet and get to know these fine gentlemen. Despite the regime for which they fought, and had little choice in doing so, I found them very friendly, respectful, and to a man, they each despised the war and wished it had never occurred. The Third Reich's fighter pilots destroyed some 70,000 enemy aircraft during the war, with approximately 45,000 destroyed on the Eastern Front. For example, Jagdgeschwader 52, or JG-52 alone, is credited with more than 10,000 enemy planes shot down. Of these Luftwaffe aces, 103 pilots scored more than 100 victories, while of this number, 15 pilots scored more than 200, and with two men, Erich Hartmann and Gerhard Barkhorn, shooting down 352 and 301 aircraft respectively. During the war, the Luftwaffe lost a total of 150,000 personnel killed, wounded, or missing. 70,000 of these were pilots, with more than 20,000 being fighter pilots. The last reliable date for posted losses, according to Dr. Alfred Price, and reliably checked against the German archives, posted the following losses. 44,056 air crewmen were killed or missing, with 28,200 wounded and 27,610 taken prisoner, or also reported missing. However, what is known is that by May 8, 1945, there were only approximately 2,400 Luftwaffe fighter pilots still alive and accounted for. Many, such as Erich Hartmann, Hans Asi Hahn, Hermann Graf, and Hajo Hermann, spent long years in the Soviet Gulag system in what was an illegal post-war confinement. It has been estimated that the German military lost 3,800,000 personnel killed in total, along with 635,000 civilians. By comparison, Great Britain only lost 65,000 civilians killed by German bombings, with 430,000 military personnel dead. The Soviet Union lost at least 25 million civilians and as many as 6 million military dead, not including the 25 million people Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin may have killed before the war even began, with the United States losing just over 250,000 military lives. The war in the East versus the war in the West has been sorely unappreciated by the Western Allied nations. Without a doubt, the air war between the Soviet Union and Germany was the largest theater of aerial conflict and involved far more men and aircraft. The same was true for the ground war, which pitted the two greatest military nations on Earth in a life and death struggle, where there was little, if any, quarter asked and hardly ever given. It was on this front that the air war, unlike in the West, virtually discarded the accepted rules of chivalrous warfare. Sadly, this was true on both sides, as two great opponents were locked in the ultimate example of total warfare for national survival. However, the Germans in the air hardly wavered from their concepts of chivalry and fair play, unless provoked. This is not in dispute. It should be mentioned that, in spite of wartime and even post-war propaganda, there is not a single case of a German pilot intentionally shooting a parachuting enemy on any front. Of course, accidents will happen in warfare, especially aerial combat. The Soviets, however, did not adhere to the rules of warfare as mandated by the existing Geneva Convention of 1929. In fact, killing enemy pilots, regardless of the situation, was expected. Stalin himself stated that he would neither sign nor abide by the 1929 Geneva Convention, although he did state that he would follow the rules of conflict as outlined in the Hague Convention, as previously revised in 1907. The listeners will perhaps be interested to see the thoughts of these men. True, it is hindsight and therefore reflective. However, it is also in their own words and their own experiences, seasoned by time and aged to maturity. They were the best people to discuss the war from their perspective, as opposed to historians writing about them in the third person. Writing about a man flying and fighting is not the same as the fighter pilot telling his own story. The information gathered from all of these interviews is cross-referenced with the available sources, and even other interviewed subjects. This method serves several purposes, such as verification of data based upon memory and historical accuracy to present the facts, even if in contradiction to the testimony, in order to provide a more accurate account of the events in question. History will come to life as some of Germany's bravest and best pilots tell their stories about the war, their battles, lives, and perhaps most important, how they felt about their leadership under the National Socialist German Workers' Party, or NSDAP, Nazi Party. None of these men interviewed were card-carrying National Socialists. In fact, they adhered to the long-held tradition of Überparteilichkeit, or above party affiliation. These were men who were serving their nation in the cockpits of aircraft. Their job was to fight, and, if possible, destroy the enemies of their nation. They were no different than the pilots of other nations. Setting propaganda and post-war myopia aside, the Luftwaffe pilots were not only brave men defending their country from obliteration. They were men of honor who still fought by and believed in a code of chivalry, reminiscent of the First World War, when enemy pilots often saluted each other in battle, and wounded enemies were allowed to escape to fight another day. Historian Telford Taylor blamed much of Nazi Germany's woes upon the generals, whom he blamed collectively for not being more proactive in serving their nation and resisting the Nazi Party. Taylor stated, "What the officers' corps needed and lacked were the leadership and moral discipline to protect the German name and their own tradition against the degradation with which the Third Reich had threatened both ever since its birth. Instead, for reasons which we have traced, the generals chose to become themselves a pillar of the Third Reich. Now the terrible consequences of that choice lay before them." That being said, it will be clear to the listeners that the men chronicled here were made of more solid fiber. Obviously, for the most part, World War II was a completely different environment from the previous global conflict. Totalitarian regimes, the mass murders of civilians and violations of international laws of conflict, and the sheer numbers of men and women involved in the war in the air and on the ground created an entirely new mindset regarding war. Killing became easier, and dehumanization of one's opponent through propaganda and racial and ethnic bigotry became the norm for all nations, Allied and Axis alike. The Luftwaffe men, for the most part, were above all of the polemic and prejudice, even when inundated from their youth by the evil propaganda spewed by Propaganda Minister Dr. Joseph Goebbels, the incoherent ranting of Adolf Hitler, and the illogical and the inhuman policies of both Reichsführer SS Heinrich Himmler and Reichsmarschall Hermann Wilhelm Göring. Certainly no one can look into the heart of every man, yet one tends to get a feel for the essence of who a man is when spending many hours or even days with him. Some of these men returned to military life after the war, rising to higher rank, as exemplified by Generalleutnant Günther Rall, Generalmajor Hannes Trautloft, Generalleutnant Walter Krupinski, Generalleutnant Johannes Steinhoff, Generalmajor Dietrich Rabach, and Oberst Erich Hartmann. Others chose a different path in civilian life, most engaging in business and industry. They had made their mark on history and simply wanted to live quiet lives, each in his own way. All of these men spent various amounts of time as prisoners of war when the hostilities ceased. Some were held by the British and Americans until their discharge papers were processed within 1 to 3 years after the war. Others, such as Erich Hartmann, Hermann Graf, and Hajo Hermann, would spend a decade in the Soviet Gulag system, stripped of their rank and removed from the protection of both the Geneva Convention and the International Red Cross in an illegal confinement that has still yet to be properly addressed. It should be also noted that an estimated 700,000 German POWs were held in violation of Geneva 1929 and used as forced labor by the Western Allies. No one's hands were completely clean. All of these men endured their own kind of hell, an existence that most of us could never imagine. Americans held by the Japanese in World War II, in North Korea or China, or in the Hanoi Hilton and the jungles of Vietnam by the Viet Cong, can attest to the brutality and hardships endured over several years of captivity. They know all too well the pain and fear of being held by a ruthless enemy who follows no rules but his own. It is perhaps these men, our own heroes who were mostly aviators, who were wounded and tortured, who will best appreciate the stories herein. Freedom is the most cherished ideal we as human beings have. Losing it is the greatest tragedy. Anne and I hope that the listeners of this book will look beyond the politics of the day and the post-war propaganda and see these men for who they really were. They were Germans fighting to save their nation and their populations from destruction. Some of these men suffered multiple wounds and injuries, with Johannes Steinhoff, Günther Rall, Georg Peter Eder, and Walter Krupinski being some of the best examples of men who were extremely lucky to have lived through the war. Ada, being the prime example, was wounded over a dozen times, while Steinhoff was also wounded on several occasions and burned alive. Some of the men interviewed for this series over the years were groundbreakers. Some, like Hajo Hermann, Hannes Trautloft, Eduard Neumann, Herbert Ihlerfeld, and Adolf Galland, were veterans before World War II began, as members of the famous Condor Legion that fought in support of Generalissimo Francisco Franco during the Spanish Civil War. These men brought their hands-on experience and effective tactics home to provide the Luftwaffe with a competent and well-qualified cadre of combat leaders. Wolfgang Falk, who became known as the father of the night fighters, ushered in a new form of warfare, specializing in nocturnal and limited visibility aerial combat, which was a revolutionary development in World War II, although commonplace in today's high-tech world. Likewise, Hajo Hermann, using the low-tech method of night fighting with single-seat fighters and no advanced radars, carved his name into history, flying both bombers and fighters. He had become a national hero for sinking more than 70,000 tons of Allied shipping before he created his famous Wilde Sau, wild boar tactics in July 1943. Later, he became one of Germany's most successful criminal defense attorneys, handling high-profile cases well into his 90s. Adolf Galland and Dietrich Peltz became the youngest generals of the war, each commanding the fighter and bomber forces respectively. Their abilities in combat, their competence in logistics, planning, and intelligence, as well as their abilities to inspire the unwavering loyalty of their subordinates, also created an ongoing love-hate relationship with their higher-ups. Galland's interview includes a prime example of superiors whose egos exceeded their capabilities, making their subordinates pay for their own shortcomings. The methods, tactics, and technologies the airmen employed, elements that were produced through wartime necessity, ushered in a revolution of scientific knowledge and better tactics. Both the German and British airmen during the Night War received an ever-continuing series of technological gadgets, with each side working to counter the other's latest threat with an even more effective instrument. This created the first true technological arms race, which also continues to this day. Today's military and civil aviation worlds are the direct descendants of these efforts by the first practitioners of instrument and radar-guided flying in limited visibility. Some of these pilots made history in very different ways. Krupinski, Eder, Steinhoff, Prall, Hermann, Galland, and other select German and Austrian flyers became the first jet pilots in history, with a few becoming aces in the Messerschmitt Me-262. In fact, many of these men were in great demand by the Allies on both sides after the war, due to their expertise, technological, and combat experience. Wolf Falk, Hajo Hermann, and others pushed electronic warfare, tactics, and technology to their limits, forcing their British counterparts into a war of financial and intellectual attrition. Today, many everyday military and civilian techniques, tactics, and devices, such as the microwave oven, radar detectors, airborne combat controllers, pressurized cockpits, electronic jamming and scrambling devices, as well as emission detection and control systems, to name a few, are a direct result of the Wizards' War between the RAF and the Luftwaffe. Listeners may see many connections between these men as they tell their stories. Most of them knew each other to some degree, often flying in the same units at various times. Others became acquainted with each other after the war and shared their experiences. All were lucky to have survived. Perhaps the greatest tribute to their branch of service was the creation of the Gemeinschaft der Jagdflieger, which shortly after its creation became an international organization. This community of fighter pilots opened its doors to the pilots of all nations, including the Allies, in order to further the fraternity of aerial warriors and embrace their enemies, setting all history and politics aside. The Gemeinschaft even opened its doors to some of us who were historians, interested in the German airmen's stories, with an invitation to become honorary members. It was this acceptance that launched the careers of many of us. When I was there with Walter Krupinski, then the acting Traditionsreferent, he simply told me, "Colin, I want you to join the Gemeinschaft. You know most of the guys. This will allow you greater contacts for your research." And so started my career. We hope that listeners find these first-person narratives informative and entertaining, and that they create a continued interest in the study of aerial warfare in World War II. Although the men interviewed for this book have all passed away, their contributions to history and their legacy to aviation is undeniable. I wish they were still with us to see these full interviews, edited for this series of books, come to life. Their friendships were priceless, and the assistance was also invaluable. Colin D. Heaton and Anne-Marie Lewis. German military ranks, medals, and service. Corresponding German and Allied Air Force ranks. German, Generalfeldmarschall. American, General of the Army or Air Force, 5-star. British, Air Marshal of the Royal Air Force. German, Generaloberst. American, General, 4-star. British, Air Chief Marshal. German, General der Flieger. American, Lieutenant General, 3-star. British, Air Marshal. German, Generalleutnant. American, Major General, 2-star. British, Air Vice Marshal. German, Generalmajor. American, Brigadier General, 1-star. British, Air Commodore. German, Oberst. American, Colonel. British, Group Captain. German, Oberstleutnant. American, Lieutenant Colonel. British, Wing Commander. German, Major. American, Major. British, Squadron Leader. German, Hauptmann. American, Captain. British, Flight Lieutenant. German, Oberleutnant. American, First Lieutenant. British, Flying Officer. German, Lieutenant. American, Second Lieutenant. British, Pilot Officer. German, Sonderführer. American, Warrant Officer. British, Warrant Officer. German, Hauptfeldwebel. American, Sergeant Major. British, Flight Sergeant. German, Oberfeldwebel. American, First Sergeant. British, Chief Technician. German, Stabsfeldwebel. American, Sergeant First Class. British, Sergeant. German, Feldwebel. American, Staff Sergeant. British, Junior Technician. German, Unterfeldwebel. American, Sergeant Technician. British, Senior Aircraftman. German, Unteroffizier. American, Corporal. British, Senior Aircraftman. German, Privat. American, Private. British, Leading Aircraftman. Luftwaffe Table of Organization. Office or Formation. Oberbefehlshaber der Luftwaffe. Supreme Air Force Commander. Rank of Commander, Reichsmarschall. Office or formation: Chef des Generalstabes der Luftwaffe, Chief of Air Staff. Rank of commander: General der Flieger or Generaloberst. Office or formation: Fliegerkorps, Air Corps. Rank of commander: General der Flieger or Generalleutnant. Office or formation: Fliegerdivision, Air Division. Rank of commander: General der Flieger, Generalleutnant or Generalmajor. Office or formation: Geschwader, Wing. Rank of commander: Generalmajor, Oberst, Oberstleutnant or Major with title of Kommandeur. Office or formation: Gruppe, Group. Rank of commander: Oberstleutnant, Major or Hauptmann in rare cases, with title of Kommandeur. This operational matrix was not engraved in stone. Adolf Galland was a Generalleutnant, the equivalent of an American Major General, who led a Geschwader, wing he named, which never rose above Gruppe, group strength, and hardly ever functioned above the Staffel, squadron level. Many times an officer with great ability, but not holding the rank, was placed in a command far above his pay grade. The best example was Wolfgang Falk, appointed a Commodore while only a Hauptmann on June 26, 1940, a position usually reserved for an Oberst or above. Combat attrition and the rapid redeployment of units and personnel issues also factored into the equation as well. This structure remained more or less as stated earlier, from 1939 to 1943, with few exceptions until 1942, when even more junior officers took higher levels of command responsibility. By 1944, this rank requirement was even lower in some cases. Order of the Iron Cross and Knight's Cross. The Iron Cross and its subsequent levels, listed from lowest to highest, were not just awarded for battlefield valor. Leadership and other military contributions in a battlefield environment were also factors. The Iron Cross was progressive. You had to earn the lower award before achieving the next, although simultaneous awards of 2 levels did occur. Iron Cross Second Class, Iron Cross First Class, Knight's Cross, approximately 7,500 awarded. Knight's Cross with Oak Leaves, only 860 awarded. Knight's Cross with Oak Leaves and Swords, only 159 awarded. Knight's Cross with Oak Leaves, Swords, and Diamonds, only 27 awarded. 10 to Luftwaffe pilots, 9 to fighter pilots. The one exception was Stuka pilot Oberst Hans-Ulrich Rödel. Knight's Cross with Golden Oak Leaves, Swords, and Diamonds, only awarded to Oberst Hans-Ulrich Rödel. Grand Cross of the Iron Cross, only awarded to Reichsmarschall Hermann Wilhelm Göring. The criteria for the various awards were subjective, and for pilots, the requirements for the higher awards, starting at the Oak Leaves, became more stringent as the war progressed. Scoring 40 victories on the Channel Coast between 1940 and 1941 would often secure a pilot the Knight's Cross in most cases, while 70 kills would almost guarantee the Oak Leaves, with 100 securing the Swords, and so on. However, after the invasion of the Soviet Union, with some pilots scoring 40 victories or more in a month, and even a few rare exceptions shooting down that many in a good week, Hitler raised the bar. Some may find it strange that pilots such as Günther Rahl, who scored 275 victories, and Gerhard Barkhorn, who shot down 301 adversaries, did not receive the award of the Diamonds, whereas Erich Hartmann, 352 victories, and Hermann Graf, 212, for example, were awarded them. Likewise, Adolf Galland had 104 victories, and he received the diamonds, along with Werner Mölders with 114, 14 in Spain, while the others who scored in the 200 victory range received at least the swords, but most did not receive the diamonds. Walter Nowotny, with 258 victories, held the diamonds after scoring his 250th. However, these diamonds awards for less than 200 kills were made before 1942, after the war had greatly expanded. Remember that Erich Rudolpher scored 222, Rall 275, Otto Kittel 267, and Barkhorn 301, and yet they never received the diamonds, although Barkhorn was recommended, but the war ended before they could be conferred. It is important to consider how these pilots evaluated their enemies based on their individual experiences. The war in the East was a different type of battleground than in Western Europe and North Africa. Most of the Luftwaffe victories were achieved over the Eastern Front, although several pilots, such as Josef Priller, Egon Meyer, Joachim Müncherberg, Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, Night Fighter kills, Diamonds holder, Helmut Lent, Night Fighter kills, Diamonds holder, Hans-Joachim Marseille, 7 in France and 151 in North Africa, Diamonds holder, and Adolf Leutnant Walter Krupinski was one of those men destined to always tempt fate. Beginning his flight training on October 15, 1939, he flew fighters with distinction throughout World War II, serving in Germany's most prestigious units and training, and flying with some of the world's greatest pilots, such as Adolf Galland, Otto Kittel, Dietrich Prabach, Erich Rudolpher, Gerhard Barkhorn, and Erich Hartmann. His friends and colleagues called him Krupi and Count Punski out of affection. Krupinski's leadership style was similar to that of his most prominent commanding officer, Dietrich Prabach, who was also much like the great Werner Mölders, as both men were held in high esteem by all who knew them. Krupinski's fatherly approach and genuine concern for the welfare of his pilots, as well as his respect for captured enemy pilots, illustrated his humanity in a world where savagery was the order of the day. He became a teacher to many pilots, the most notable being the future ace of aces, Erich Hartmann, who learned well from Krupi and other experts in JG-52. By the time Krupinski was awarded the Ritterkreuz, Knight's Cross, on October 29, 1942, he had been credited with shooting down 53 Allied aircraft. His final score of 197 could have been much higher, but he never claimed a probable victory or argued over a disputed claim, always giving the victory to the other man. Krupinski probably gave away more than 30 potential victories in that manner. To him, a victory was just not that important. He flew more than 1,100 combat missions, entered combat more than 600 times, became one of the first jet pilots, and survived many incredible events, which he related in the course of his many interviews. His chivalrous attitude and Prussian birth earned him the nickname Graf Count Punski, a name that lingered in the reunion halls and among his friends, until his death in October 2000, when I last spent time with him in Strasbourg, France, with Heinz Ewald, Hajo Hermann, Wolfgang Falk, Günther Rall, Eduard Neumann, Gerhard Schöpfel, and many others, along with my great friend, fellow author and historian, John Gutman. After the war, Kopinski worked closely with organization Gehlen, the West German Secret Service, named for and operated by the wartime and post-war intelligence general Reinhard Gehlen, and also with the American Central Intelligence Agency, work that he declined to discuss in detail, honoring his oaths of secrecy. He joined the West German Air Force, worked with the United States and Royal Air Forces, assisted in the early foundations of the emerging North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, and later functioned as a coordinator and leader in the new Bundesluftwaffe. Walter and his wife lived in modest retirement at their home in Neunkirchen, Germany. Kopinski had often assisted me in contacting many of Germany's aces for interviews, and he himself agreed to be interviewed many times, the last being in 1999. What follows are his experiences during the war and his reflections about his life in his own words. An abridged version of this interview was published in Military History in June 1998. Walter Kopinski. My name is Walter Kopinski, and I was born on November 11, 1920, in a little town called Donau in East Prussia, which is now under the jurisdiction of the Russian government. But I lived in Braunschweig, which is currently under the Polish government. I recently visited Braunschweig, where the family had lived from 1933 to 1945, and found that it has changed a little since I was last there. In fact, I found my old home, and even the old sewing machine my mother had used when I was a child. It was very strange, as well as very familiar, almost comforting. When I was born, my father was in military service. He had been in the First World War, as were all the able-bodied men, and later, as the war ended, he was called upon to serve again. At that time, starting in 1918, he was fighting against the communist groups trying to take control of Germany after the war, and the first large riots started in Berlin, as well as the Navy revolt that occurred in Kiel and other places. He served in the Army during World War I and after, until 1923 or 1924. He finally left the Army and became a government employee. He soon joined the Army again before the outbreak of World War II, but he was discharged after the 1939 Polish campaign ended as a first lieutenant. Later during the war, my father became a government employee once again, but as the war progressed, he was enlisted as a member of the Volkssturm, civilians conscripted in defense of Germany in the closing days of the war, as the Soviets entered Germany proper from January to May 1945. I had two younger brothers, Paul and Günther. Paul and I were born on the same date, but 2 years apart. Paul joined the Kriegsmarine and entered the Unterseeboot submarine service, where he met his fate. He was killed when his boat, U-771, was sunk off the Norwegian coast, and only the bodies of Paul and a non-commissioned officer were found on the shore. U-771 went down with all hands in Andfjord after being torpedoed by the British submarine HMS Venturer on November 11, 1944. They were buried at the military cemetery in Narvik, Norway. My youngest brother, Günther, was born in 1932, and he fled Prussia to the west with my mother in January 1945, during the Soviet advance. He died of cancer in 1970. My education was the same as most of the others in the Luftwaffe and the military in general. Primary school and then the gymnasium, similar to an American high school but a little more advanced, studying the basic curriculum. I passed the Abitur, which is the final exit examination, in 1938 and decided to join the military. I had thought about joining the Navy. I always liked ships and the sea, having read many books and high-adventure novels, such as the works of Robert Louis Stevenson and Daniel Defoe. I also liked Herman Melville and the like. What is probably very interesting is that I never really had any interest in flying. In fact, I attempted to become a naval officer like my friends Johannes Steinhoff and Dietrich Rabach, as I always liked the sea. However, when I finally was admitted into the Navy, they transferred me to the Luftwaffe. I did not apply for it. It seemed as if fate threw us all, Steinhoff and Rabach, together for most of our lives, even far beyond the war. I started flight training as a new Luftwaffe pilot candidate, training in September 1939, just as the Polish campaign started, at the Officers' Cadet School at Berlin-Gatow, later transferring to Vienna-Schwekat, which was the fighter weapons school. So I missed the first battles of the war. It all started with classroom instruction, aerodynamics, the basics really. Then, after a couple of months in the classroom, we were introduced to the Heinkel HE-51 biplane trainer, in which we learned the basics of takeoffs and landings, or touch and goes, as well as proper aerial maneuvers with an instructor. When we were considered competent, we soloed, and I just took to it quickly. The instructors looked at us, assessed our strengths and weaknesses, and somehow made suggestions as to who would transition into fighters, bombers, or dive bombers. They did allow us to apply for what type of aircraft we wanted to fly, and I learned that the bomber and reconnaissance programs were much longer than the fighter program, due to the extra requirements for long-range navigation and more detailed instrument rating requirements. Well, I knew that if I went into fighters, I would get to the front more quickly. I also thought about the survival ratings between fighter and bomber pilots, and figured I would mostly on the HE-51 and Arado types, that we actually trained on the Messerschmitt Me-109, which, as you know, was actually the primary fighter throughout the war, with around 35,000 being built. I know this has been said many times, but I think it is very important to say here. The Me-109 was a fine fighter when it was in its element. That element was higher altitude and in a diving battle, but it was a good dogfighter with good weapons, with the 7.92mm machine guns and the 20mm centrally mounted cannon. Just a few hits from those would bring down almost anything. It also had what we called short legs, and therefore did not have the range necessary to be a great fighter for long missions. The tricky part about flying the 109 was the takeoff and landing. Now, this is true of any aircraft, but in the 109, you had to really stand on the rudder until you achieved airspeed. Otherwise, you could pull a ground loop. This was due to the torque of the engine on the propeller. Once you mastered that, you were fine. However, landing was just as hazardous. The 109 was the first German monoplane fighter with a retractable landing gear, developed in 1935. The plane was better with each variant produced, but they all had the same Achilles heel. The landing gear undercarriage was very narrow. Many pilots cracked up landing the 109, and this happened quite often after we transferred from the grass fields in the Soviet Union to hard surface airstrips in the defense of the Reich. It was sometimes quite embarrassing, and I should know. I cracked up a couple of 109s on landing myself during my career. The gear struts were mounted centrally under the fuselage at the wing root. This was good for weight displacement and allowing for more fuel and weapons to be introduced later. It also helped the fighter to have a great roll rate, very important in combat. However, that narrow landing gear caused a lot of problems for many trainees, and many fighters were cracked up on the landing during training. The other problem with the 109 in combat was the fact that it was liquid-cooled, meaning the radiator was vulnerable to damage, which, if hit, would cause a coolant leak and the engine overheating. This was an experience that I and most fighter pilots are very familiar with. Most of us Luftwaffe pilots who were forced to bail out or crash land did so with this very problem being the reason. I must admit that I liked the Focke-Wulf FW-190 for the reason that it had an air-cooled radial engine, and it was also a great heavy weapons platform. It was faster, more maneuverable, and better for engaging bombers and ground attack than the 109, in my opinion. The FW-190 could also take more structural damage than a 109. However, most of us fell in love with the 109, because once you mastered the airplane, it was a very reliable fighter. Then, getting back to the training. After achieving competence in the fighter, we trained on instrument flying, enemy aircraft identification, emergency procedures, formation flying, gunnery skills such as deflection shooting, and learned about our own particular aircraft, including minor maintenance. In Russia, that was to become very important, as we never really had a solid supply line after 1943. Our mechanics were always worked to death, so knowing more about your own aircraft and doing minor things helped everyone. Shortly after completing the year-long training process, I was transferred to the Channel Coast, and in late October 1940, assigned to JG-52, Jagdgeschwader or Fighting Wing 52, where Günther Rall, Dieter Hrabak, Johannes Steinhoff, Gerhard Barkhorn, who transferred to JG-2 Richthofen and then returned to JG-52, as Hrabak alternated between JG-52 and 54, and others were starting their careers, later becoming Experten, which was a term usually used for those with 100 or more kills. By the time I got involved in the war, the Battle of Britain was just about over, which was in November 1940. I flew only 30 missions over the United Kingdom, and I was involved in a few dogfights with Supermarine Spitfires and Hawker Hurricanes, but scored no victories. I was a slow starter, as I was suffering from bad shooting, and I was very anxious since I was afraid of being shot down over the English Channel and having to swim home. I was then commissioned as a lieutenant in 6 JG-52, 6th Staffel or Squadron of JG-52, in February 1941. I served at the Channel Front until the late spring of 1941, when JG-52 was transferred east. We flew from Ostend in Belgium to Suwałki in East Prussia, and we had been staging there 10 days prior to Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941. The war started for us at Suwałki, where we took off to perform ground attack missions against the Red Air Force airfields. During these missions, there was not much air-to-air combat. We mostly strafed airfields, at least in my squadron, destroying aircraft on the ground. We did not get credits for victories against those. I was also quite surprised that there was not much anti-aircraft fire, hardly any at all during that time. I was certain that, given the response, we had caught them completely by surprise. However, I also believed that we were to be the target of an advanced Soviet attack, as their aircraft were all staged in forward areas, in what appeared to be preparation for offensive operations. I flew a lot with Gerd Barkhorn, and usually Heinz Ewald was his wingman, but later he usually flew with me, and then later Erich Hartmann flew as my wingman quite often, until he became a Staffelkapitän. In 1942, I was transferred to the replacement group of JG-52, then to 6th Staffel, attached to Zweite Gruppe, 2nd JG-52 in southern Russia. This was where I also flew with Rall, Steinhoff, Herbert Ihlefeld, Willy Batz, and Hrabak for a while. Later, I became Staffelkapitän for 7th Staffel of 3rd JG52 during the transfer to Romania with Erich Hartmann, Hermann Graf, Heinz Ewald, Helmut Lippfert and others, guarding the Ploiesti oil fields and refinery, bridges and that sort of thing, from the American long-range bombers from North Africa. And later I went to Italy for a short time until the spring of 1944. I must say I like Southern Europe more than Russia. I still go there for vacations to warm my bones. The Russian winter. It's famous, you know, and all of the horror stories are true. We could not fly many times due to heavy snow and bad weather, and when we could fly, it was hard to know how to get back unless you flew totally on instruments, and landings were quite often more hazardous than combat. Engines would not start due to the oil freezing. Incredible. Many planes cracked up as well. Naturally, I was there with Steinhoff, 176 victories, Oblesser, 127, Graf, 212, Ihlefeld, 132, Grasser, 103, Grislavsky, 133, Rahl, 275, Prabach, 125, Barkhorn, 301, Batz, 237, Ewald, 84, Duttmann, 152, and many others who became well-known names. Later, when Helmut Lippfert, 203, and Erich Hartmann, 352 joined, we were quite a crew. We all had the same experience, but not just during that winter. Every winter in Russia was miserable, but we were better prepared for the winters after the experience of 1941 to 1942. Like most German pilots, I liked the 109 more than any other fighter I flew during the war, probably due to the familiarity I had with it. I think that we make that collective statement due to the ease of flying, the comfortable fit of the cockpit, and the instrument layout. Everything was within easy reach, and we also had a good weapons system, and the Revi gun sight was a very nice piece of equipment. It was not a true computer gun sight, but it was reflective, with a yellow ball and a targeting sight with range estimation. If you knew your weapons, you could estimate the range to your target, and then fire. The best of the deflection shooters, like Novotny, Rahl, Marseille, and others, used this sight to good effect. I preferred to close as fast as I could, and then fire from no more than 200 meters. The closer, the better. That way, no bullets or shells go stray, you conserve ammunition, and every round makes an impact. Even better, you are close enough to assess the damage to the aircraft. This was what I taught Hartmann, and Grislavsky had him for a while also, so he had good on-the-job training. However, there were some drawbacks to closing in close and getting the kill. Whenever Hartmann was forced down, it was always by flying debris from his victories. He was never shot down by enemy fighters. He was downed by his victims. I also had a similar experience once, against a Yak in the area of the Crimean Peninsula, when I closed in after shooting down his wingman. I hit this fellow with a full cannon shot, perhaps 5 shells that ripped into the fuel tank. The fighter blew up, and pieces of the fighter cracked my canopy, put large holes in my right wing surface, and the right ailerons hardly worked. In 1941, we really did not have a lot of air combat, not when compared to later in the war, but this increased in 1942. After Rahl crashed in November 1941, while we were fighting in the Caucasus, the front seemed to go to sleep a little. We heard reports from the North Front that there was hardly any activity. Then, after February 1942, the war picked up pace. I can tell you that from the reports we received up and down the front, the northern sector stayed pretty static. The central sector had more action, but was pretty stable, with air activity being constant, steady. However, in the southern sector, where we were, the war just exploded. It was as if Stalin had taken a personal hatred against JG-52 and sent every plane and pilot he had against us. We had just lost Raab, and we did not even believe that he would ever come back, and Steinhoff had taken over some of his duties. In fact, I was with Mackey on this mission when he shot down 3 planes in less than 1 minute. Absolutely incredible, as I was about 200 meters behind him, covering his tail, and I had yet to score any kills on this mission. Mackey chased 2 Yaks and fired into one, and that fighter simply disintegrated, and the other broke right, but Mackey made a deflection shot that nailed him solid, and he also went down. Then, out of nowhere, another Yak flew past me at great speed and was going to get Steinhoff, who was still turning hard right, reversing course, which brought his 109 head-on into the Yak as he pulled up. I saw both the Yak and 109 fire, but the Yak took the worst of it, shuddered, stalled, and Mackey flew past and above the Yak. They were so close, I thought they would collide. My fighter just happened to pull alongside the left wing of the Yak, Mackey's 3rd kill, and being only 40 or so feet away, very close, I could clearly see the pilot. He was beating against the canopy, trying to open it as smoke began filling the cockpit, and flames began to erupt from the cowling. The front of the Yak had been shredded by Mackey's 20mm cannon fire. The Yak's canopy must have been jammed shut from the 109's guns, as I could see shell strikes all over the bevel, where the canopy frame meets the fuselage. The plane started burning even more from the engine, the fuel line apparently feeding the flames. I saw the terror in this man's face, and I was even screaming into my oxygen mask for him to get out, which was silly. There was no way he could hear me, so I made the hand gesture for him to get out. Mackey pulled alongside him on his right and saw as well what was happening. I heard Mackey over my radio. "Jesus Christ, Punsky. I hope he can get out." And I could feel Mackey's emotions. The man in that plane had no surface control. The elevators were gone, and the rudder was just hanging on. He could do nothing but ride out this flaming torch until it crashed, killing him, or he burned to death slowly, or the smoke killed him. He could not bail out, and we were at high altitude, perhaps 8,000 feet or so, I think, and I knew he would not survive a crash landing. Mackey knew this also. "Punsky, go away. I will catch you," he told me. I knew what he was going to do. It was a clear violation of our ethics to kill a disabled opponent, one who was fairly beaten. But this was not murder. Mackey was performing a mercy killing. That pilot was going to burn to death, slowly. Before I pulled away, I saw him slip in just behind the Yak. Then the Soviet pilot, who must have known what was going to happen, just relaxed and gestured with a wave and nodded his head. He knew what was going to happen, and this was simply his way of saying, "Thank you." I rolled away and called the men to form up on me, as all of them were watching this spectacle. As I reversed course, I could not help but look over, as did Ewald, and the Yak had apparently already exploded. There was nothing but a large, evaporating ball of black dust and flame. The minimal pieces of the wreckage rained down like confetti. Some missions stand out more than others, for many reasons, but this is the most vivid image I ever took away from the war, other than Mackey's crash on April 18, 1945. I felt a cold chill come over me. I think that this was perhaps the sobering moment, That time in your career where the reality of death is most vivid, and could only be more so if it were happening to you. Once we all landed, I walked over to my superior officer and good friend, Mackie Steinhoff, who just stood there, leaning against his fighter, his hand on the fuselage. I swear I think he was crying. I know he was. He knew that killing and shooting down aircraft was our job. But this mission really shook him up. He always tried to shoot the plane, not the pilot. That was just his way. He was a true knight in every sense of the word. Ada was the same way. They were cut from the same cloth. Mackie Steinhoff would not talk to anyone beyond discussing war business for several days after that event. I do not think it ever left him, and beyond that day in the Caucasus, we never spoke of it again. The only thing he said was, "If I am ever in that situation, please do the same. I would not want to burn alive trapped in my fighter." I assured him that would never happen, but I gave him my word anyway. How ironic, almost 3 years later to the day, he would be trapped in a burning fighter, and there was nothing any of us could do to help him. For us, 1942 was a busy year, and this was when we first encountered Spitfires in the Caucasus, which happened later that year. I had seen them in France earlier in the war, but not in Russia. We knew that the Allies were supplying the Soviets with tanks, trucks, aircraft, and all kinds of things. But this was a new development. We had heard reports of Spitfires and Hurricanes being engaged, and even a few shot down, but none of us had been that lucky. Well, in August 1942, I came across a few, and these pilots were not your average Russian. These fellows knew their business. There were also some American-made twin-engine bombers that the Soviets used with great effect, and we also encountered these on occasion. We had been flying non-stop throughout 1942, scoring a lot of victories and losing a lot of good men. The 6th Army had entered Stalingrad on the Volga in September, and the 11th Army was taking care of the Crimea. We had been stopped at Moscow the previous December, but our superiors assured us that this was only a minor setback. That fall, Hermann Graf dominated the air over Stalingrad in his Messerschmitt Me-109. In 30 days, he shot down 62 Soviet aircraft, and I witnessed a few of these kills. One of those missions was a dogfight that Ewald and I had with an expert Russian pilot and his wingman when I was with JG-52, which lasted for about 15 minutes, which was rare for a Red Army pilot. After his tally reached 172, Graf was awarded the Diamonds to the Knight's Cross on September 16, 1942. One of only 9 fighter pilots to receive this enviable decoration, and one of only 4 pilots having that award for reaching 200 kills, I believe. And he did so in the course of more than 830 missions. It must be remembered that Graf scored 200 of his kills in only 13 months of combat. That was quite astounding. Those next 2 victories were hardly worth it. I was over enemy territory. I could not roll or bank very well, and the cold sub-zero wind was blasting me inside my cockpit. I decided that it was time to leave, and I managed to touch down on my grass strip. Actually, I glided in with a whirling propeller, since the engine died due to a lack of fuel. I had apparently been damaged in my main fuel cell, and I was losing fuel. Although my fuel gauge never registered I was losing fuel at all. I had just become commanding officer of 7th Staffel of 3rd Gruppe JG-52 when, in March 1943, I first met Erich Hartmann. He had been with JG-52 since about October with Paula Rossmann, and had been groomed by him and Alfred Krislavsky, as well as later Dieter Hrabak, who took over from Hubertus von Boden. He was such a child, so young, and that was when I gave him the nickname of Bubi, or Boy, and it stuck with him for the rest of his life. He remembered me from about 6 months earlier, when I had a memorable crash landing in a burning Me-109 at Maikop. He had just arrived and was assigned to 3rd Gruppe JG-52 under Hubertus von Boden, although we did not formally meet. I was shot all up after a sortie against the Soviets, a very difficult mission, and I was blinded by smoke and slightly wounded. Later we heard the early reports that Hartmann had a bad habit of breaking formation and losing his aircraft with little to show for the efforts. He learned eventually, after being grounded a couple of times. Regarding this mission, we had flown 8 of our Me-109s to look for a group of Ilyushin IL2 Stormovik bombers, and we found over a dozen of them with a like number of fighter escorts, mostly yachts. These fighter pilots were not the usual suspects, and their markings indicated a Red Banner unit. These were the fighter units that contained the best and brightest Soviet pilots, real hotshots who knew how to fly and fight. They looked for a fight, unlike the average enemy pilot. The Yak was also a fighter that you could not underestimate. It had great speed, could outdive us, outclimb us, and was just as good, if not better, in a turning fight. Unlike their brothers in the more traditional units, these men wanted to fight. Once you engaged, you had to keep your head. The Red Banner fighters would dogfight with you, and then ram you if they could once they were out of ammunition. I saw this happen on more than one occasion. It happened to me once, while I was flying with Dieter Hrabak as the element leader. One of our guys called out enemy aircraft at 9 o'clock low. We had the altitude advantage, about 2,000 meters in fact, so I banked over and told my wingman, who I believe was Heinz Ewald, to follow me. I went into a shallow dive, pulled up and closed in quickly on the trailing IL2, and when I was perhaps 300 meters away, I fired. I continued firing as I closed the distance, short bursts, cannon only. The rear gunner was hit. I knew this, as glass flew everywhere. It just exploded. Almost immediately afterward, the engine started smoking, so I continued on. I stepped on the left rudder and drifted into a really good firing position to engage another bomber. I scored some good hits on him, and the aircraft's engine exploded. The range was only 100 meters, so I kicked more rudder to avoid a collision. The engine fire turned to black smoke, and he dropped out of formation. Ewald called out more Indians, and we attacked, as they were below us, 2 IL-2 Stormoviks. Ewald managed to shoot one down, and another pilot got the second, both using the standard method: close in and hit the oil cooler. This was really the only way to shoot down one of these airplanes. I had once wasted an entire inventory of ammunition, to include all of the ammunition in my 20mm cannon, into just one Stormovik to bring it down. These planes were built like tanks, and could withstand all but the heaviest 88mm and larger AA fire. I was once able to inspect a crash-landed IL-2, and I studied it closely. All of us did. We located the bomber's Achilles heel. The radiator coolant system was centrally located, and if you could come up from below and attack, that was the place to aim for. I taught Hartmann this, as well as many others, as I mentioned before. I flew into a formation of 8 IL-2s, and I followed them right through our flak screen. Now this was not the brightest thing to do, but I really wanted to get a couple of kills. Suddenly, one of the enemy bombers took a direct flak hit, and the entire plane was thrown up about 100 feet straight up, above the others. It was still flying, streaming smoke. Never one to pass up an opportunity, I pulled the nose up and finished him off. Then I kicked left rudder and fired into the cockpit of the nearest IL2. He started smoking and went down, both men bailing out. I then knew I had enough ammunition for a third pass, when suddenly my fighter was hit by flak. I felt the engine dismount from the brackets forward of the firewall. Shrapnel had torn dozens of holes in the right wing. The canopy was blown off, and smoke was coming into the cockpit. I smelled burning oil, and then decided to bail out. I looked up and released my straps to climb out. But when I looked up, I saw the ground. I was upside down and did not know it, so I moved the stick all the way to the left, but the plane would not respond. I looked at the altimeter, which had disappeared, as the instrument panel was gone. Well, as I could see soldiers clearly on the ground, bailing out was not an option, and landing upside down was definitely not my first choice. As if by divine intervention, my 109 was rocked again by flak, which luckily righted the plane. I looked ahead, saw an open field, and then decided not to trust the landing gear. I plowed right into a smooth landing, perhaps the smoothest forced landing I ever had. I got out, walked away as my plane started to burn furiously. 3 of my friends